Hey everybody, it's Daniel here from the Break It Down show, and today's guest is Fredrik deBoer. He's the author of the book called The Cult of Smart: How Our Broken Education System Perpetuates Social Injustice. Freddie joins Pete and today's co-host Chris Renner. They are discussing his latest book. Most of us don't have much in common with President Trump, but when he lashed out after Joe Biden suggested he wasn't smart in the last presidential debate, Trump reminded us that both we and he are stuck in what Freddie calls the cult of smart, a veneration of a narrow kind of intelligence. You already know what to do. Go to savethebrave.org and support these fellas. We fight together PTSD. If you want to support our show, please go to the PayPal link, put a little money in it. All the money goes back to the show, so check out our website. It's breakitdownshow.com. You can find our merch, or you can simply subscribe to any podcast platform. You can also find us on YouTube. You can watch our videos there. And enough of me. Here comes Fredrik deBoer.
Lions Rock Productions.
This is Jay
This
Moore.
is Greg Proops.
This is Jordan Harbinger.
This is Dexter from The Offspring.
This is Nathan
This is
East.
Sebastian Younger.
This is Rick
This
Marotta.
is Stuart Copeland.
This is Mick Gillette.
This is Andy Summers.
Hey, this is Skunk Baxter.
This is Gabby Reese.
This is Rob Bell.
Hey, this is John Leon Guerrero.
Hey, and this is Pete A. Turner.
Hi, this is Freddie deBoer, and we are live on the Break It Down show. Sorry.
And now, the Break It Down show with John Leon Guerrero and Pete A. Turner.
Yeah, we are live on the Break It Down show, and I've got a new a friend and a guy from a group that I do a lot of writing and talking and trying to figure out issues and everything. So his name's Chris Renner, and he's the one that said, "Hey, we got to get Freddie on the show." So, Chris, talk more about why Freddie is on the show.
Sure. Freddie, you're on here because I read your fine book. Let me get it out here because I'm sure you've got it around, but. This, he happened to. I can blank on exactly how I came across your book in my suggested reading list, but I grabbed it and from our local public library here in Northern Virginia has it in stock, and I found it to be wonderfully insightful. And you've come to a lot of the conclusions that I've come to independently, obviously from different political perspectives, but it was kind of mind blowing to see that, for example. You talking so extensively about people conflating intelligence and overall human worth, and that's something that I really hope. Looking forward to. I'm glad to be here and be able to talk some more about that.
Great, glad to be here.
Yeah. Why don't you start by?
Let me ask Freddie a question. Freddie, when you write this book and you come out, one of the things that you do say a lot is that like you are looking critically at both sides of the aisle. We struggle with this. This is the problem. Do we do school vouchers or do we make schools better? Where do we put the money? Does it follow the child? The union seems to have a problem with making sure the kid goes first, and yet the union has to protect the teachers. It's a complex problem. When you started to set out on this, did you try to put this thing in a spot where it's uncomfortable but palatable for both sides of the aisle so we could actually get something done?
I don't know about palatable. I definitely was going for uncomfortable for both sides of the aisle. But look, I've said many times, education, in terms of the major political issues in American life, education is the one with the least breadth of argumentative possibilities. There's the least diversity of opinion that is presented publicly in major places about education as compared to any other field. So this gets to a couple of things. The first reason for this is because in education, you always have this prohibition against leaving children behind, whatever that means. So if you say things or articulate things that seem to suggest that there are natural limits on what education can do, and that some kids are going to be stuck in the lower quartiles of the academic performance distribution, people think that is offensive because they think that is saying that you're abandoning these kids. I wrote the whole book to articulate how not to abandon those kids. But the other thing that you have to understand is that the funding mechanisms in education research and policy are really messed up. So taken as a whole, the most powerful force in American education is just like the aggregate decision making of all of the local school boards across the country. But in terms of like true national or federal level, like something that pertains to the whole country, the most powerful force in American education is not the Department of Education. It's not the academic, university education research departments. The most powerful force in education is the think tank industrial complex. So there's no issue that is more tied to the apparatus of think tanks, the research that they put out, the grants that they fund, the influence that they have in local school districts. There's nothing that's more deeply influenced than think tanks than education. And think tanks are, they will often represent themselves from being across a spectrum, but in fact, they represent a really narrow band. And they do so because they're donor funded, generally speaking. Either they're funded by something like the Ford Foundation, which already has a very narrow sense of what education should be doing, or they're funded by people like Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg and his wife. And those people have like a really narrow idea of education is the thing that rescues people from poverty and anyone can flourish and succeed, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. So it's hard to expand the conversation because the funding sources for the most powerful and most influential players in the whole system are determined on getting a particular kind of outcome.
Mm-hmm. As far as think tanks, which specific organizations do you have in mind that deal with ed policy?
I mean, so the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, that is a foundation. Right. It's nonprofit, but it's a private organization. Mm-hmm. It has no formal governmental capacity to pass policy. But the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation passed the Common Core across the country. Like the Common Core adoption in a very short period, in a matter of a couple of years. All right. Almost every state in the country adopted the Common Core. They did so often under the cover of night, with legislation that was barely discussed or covered in the local medias. And the Gates Foundation just funded that whole effort, and they just blanketed the country with this thing. Now, there's a few less than there were before because in some conservative states, they found out that Bill Gates was behind it and they associated that with big government or whatever. So some of them dropped it. But I believe right now it's 41 states adhere to the Common Core. So that's a absolutely massive change or set of changes to American public education that was essentially decided by a few unelected bureaucrats at an incredibly wealthy think tank. Sure. And that's the perfect example of how they influence everything.
Right. Now that's something that it's interesting to hear that too, because to briefly mention my background, I work at a nonprofit that does grant making, and we have thoughts on philanthropy, and usually when we talk about something like getting results like that as a philanthropist, that's like it's sort of seen as an unallocated good thing, and it's. As you're mentioning here, it can be, private sector does not mean accountable, beneficial, or anything like that. Like the conservative tendency until the past few years has been to think of it. So that's definitely I appreciate that. So.
I have a question, Freddie. When we look at all of these problems, there are these external factors, unions, think tanks, all of these other things that have a role in this process, whether we want them to be there or not. Mm-hmm. And then we have I've deployed a lot. I've seen the government try to create stability in conflict zones, and it's really tough to come across a reliable, repeatable method. And so one of the things I know is that the best idea is probably not in that room. It's probably amongst those kids and those teachers, right? But you can't just have a grassroots approach because then you never have a strategic goal. So, I mean, when you looked at this, you examined this, is there, like we talk about like the war on drugs, the war on terror. I mean, right now we've got the war on race. There's no outcomes in these things. So we're just kind of going after this this problem temporarily with no, look at it. Is there a way out of this? I mean, is this maze too established? Do we have to blow the whole thing up? What are your thoughts on trying to balance all this stuff?
So it looked like we cannot fix the system according to the terms that the system now uses. In other words, the system wants better overall numbers in standardized testing, in grade point average, in graduation rates, etc. We can't fix that. We can make it appear that we fixed that. So high school graduation rates have never been higher. Okay, it's been a massive success, the high school graduation rise, except when you consider that none of the underlying numbers have improved. Right, so kids who are performing just like the kids who came before them academically are now getting graduated at a far higher rate. Why would that be? Because the policy apparatus has been putting so much pressure on a graduation rate for so long that individual schools responded the way that was perfectly predictable, which is they have made graduating from high school really easy. So we have achieved one of the goals we set for ourselves, but we did it by manipulating the goal. From my perspective, if we're honest about the numbers, no, that can't be fixed. We can create a more humane and practical set of goals for what we want education to accomplish. But for me, it all comes back to the system will not accept what is to me the most important and most obvious fact about education that there is, which is educational mobility is very low. It always has been. There's no reason to think that will ever change. Okay, so when we talk about educational mobility, we're not talking about a kid who didn't know the state capitals memorizes those state capitals. That's not educational mobility. Mobility is this kid's 15th in class ranking, but then he changes to 7th. The kid at 7 drops to 10. The black kids are improving their position in the class rank relative to the white kids. There's now more girls in the top 5, whatever. That's educational mobility, the movement of individual students in the performance hierarchy, right? This is not a secret, and the evidence behind it is not disputable. But people act like this or don't talk about it. They just avoid this. Kids sort themselves into ability bands at a very early age in school. They say, I'm a D- student, I'm an A+ student, everywhere in between, right? They sort themselves into those ability bands, and to a remarkable degree, they stay in those ability bands the rest of their lives. Okay, so oftentimes people think about education, they think, well, this kid's coming up and this kid's going down, and that's just not what we see. Over and over and over again, we see that kids maintain their position within the distribution. And there's all kinds of ways that you can represent this statistically in the research record. So there's like at any given age in the K through 12 system, you can pick a kid's position, even in kindergarten, and have really good predictive information about where they'll be when they're a graduating senior in high school. Okay, so here's a somewhat notorious example. Just 3rd grade reading group. So most schools have 1, 2, 3, or sometimes 1, 2, 3, 4 levels of reading group in their lower grades, and it's common for them to have this structure in 3rd grade. Just 3rd grade reading group gives us a really good indication about who's going to graduate from high school and go to college. Okay, so we know at 3rd grade this kid is going to succeed academically, and this kid isn't. There are exceptions, right? There's plenty of individual kids who transcend their station or fall below it. But from the 10,000 feet perspective of the system, it's remarkably static. And it goes beyond that. I mean, you give SAT scores to 12-year-olds and you wait a couple decades. Those SAT scores don't just tell us how well they'll do in high school and college, although it tells us that very well. It tells us, will any of those kids ever hold a patent? Will any of those kids ever get a book published by a Big 5 publisher? Will any of those kids get tenure at a major research university, right? So we know with disturbingly granular detail what eventual academic performance will be like early on in life. And a huge part of my book is just saying, like, this should be the first thing we discuss all the time when we talk about education. but it is almost never discussed in educational circles because it's uncomfortable and because it cuts against the ideology of every kid can succeed, right? It directly contradicts the basic propaganda of the system, which is that any kid is a potential budding academic superstar. You know,
Can you talk a little more about that? Now that the that blank slate theory, I think, is the way of describing that.
Yeah. So the way that I have described my thoughts about this in the past are, I sometimes call it, I'm mechanism agnostic about this. In other words, I don't have one particular explanatory mechanism of why kids sort themselves this way. I only know that they do. However, it is certainly, the most plausible explanation for me is that this is the result of genes. I'm going to be presenting at a genomics conference at the end of April for a conference all about this particular discussion. But the blank slate theory is simply the idea that, human beings are the product of, our attributes, our thinking, our performance in school, etc. It's all environmental, right? Our environment influences us, like our parenting environment, and that shapes us and makes us who we are. If you take two kids and you give them the exact same environment, which is hard because you got to include the maternal environment, meaning like in the womb. But anyway, if you give them the exact same environment, they will produce the exact same life, right? And we just know that we should know that that's just not the way the world functions, right? Like human beings are animals, right? We are the product of the transmission of genetic information from parent to child. We know that the transmission of genetic information from parent to child influences us in a great many ways. This is not generally controversial if you say, hey, this kid's a great athlete, his parents were great athletes. People don't usually worry about that. Nobody disputes that height has a strong genetic component, et cetera. And nobody disputes that, the color of your eyes has a genetic component. When it comes to anything cognitive or behavioral, people have a big problem with it. It is extremely controversial territory to wander into. The most obvious reason being because to some, it sounds like, pseudoscientific racism, like, bell curve style racism. It's not, as I take pains in the book to say, that's actually not a good assumption that you're making, right? I will often use the analogy of a jumping contest. We take a bunch of kids, right? And we say, okay, you're going to have a jumping contest. We're going to see who can jump the highest. But for some cruel reason, we put weight belts on one section of the kids, right, so that they can't jump as high because the weight belt is weighing them down. And another section of kids, we put them in springy shoes so they can jump higher. If we look at the outcomes of that competition, we will almost certainly find that as a class, the weight belt kids do the worst and the springy shoe kids do the best. That's an environmental difference between them, right? Like they're the outcomes, these systematic outcomes that are the result of things that we've chosen, this environmental thing. We can say with confidence that's what's happening is environmental. Right. But within any group, right? Within the group of kids with weight belts, within the group of kids with springy shoes, within the kids with neither, you're going to have variation. Some kids will jump much better than others inside each group. And some kids from the weight belt group might be so talented at jumping that they're among the highest jumpers, even with the weight belt, because their talent is that powerful, right? Some kids with the springy shoes just don't have that athletic ability. They're going to be way down, right? So the difference between individuals in the groups, right, is partially genetically influenced, while the difference between the groups is environmental. There's no contradiction in saying that. So, and I think that that's the most likely outcome of what's happening in American public schooling, that we know that Black students have systematically different environments than white in a variety of ways, and that is creating the perceived difference in academic outcomes, but that also, right, within any of those groups, right, You can take two students with seemingly exactly the same demographic information, two Black students from the suburbs of Detroit who go to a charter school, who have two parents in the home, who make between $55,000 and $65,000 a year, and who are enrolled in an after-school program. You can just pile these identifiers, these environmental identifiers on, and you'll take a look at the two kids, and they have vastly different educational outcomes, right? You can't match environment so closely that you actually produce kids who look the same. And to me, that's the question of interest that faces the American educational system, is not the between group issue, right? I mean, look, there's plenty of grant money going to studying the racial achievement gap right now. I don't study that also. The question is why do kids who appear to be so evenly matched in demographic and environmental information perform so differently? And I would say, again, I'm agnostic about the mechanism. I don't know that it's genes. People way smarter than me are going to have to decide if it's genes. I'm not that kind of smart. We know that genes influence cognition in animals, including primates. Right. So it's like, why would that suddenly stop being true when evolution gets to the stage of the human being? I don't know.
When you're talking about all of this stuff, I'm thinking about Judith Rich Harris's work, talking about the nurture assumption and what a shakeup that was to the entire behavioral sciences as she de-siloed everybody and said, by the way, parents, you can screw your kid up, but you can't reliably make your kid great because there's just too much nature in there, like those genes, and you don't get to pick what genes you give to your kid, unfortunately. And then just all the other external environments makes it really hard for a parent but parents hate that. And people argue with her findings all the time. And maybe one day we'll find out that is wrong, but that's not that day to day. So you're talking about a huge cultural problem where, if kids don't believe they can do something, or if kids believe they can do something, they break off on a decision tree going in a different direction, just on some belief in themselves, or having someone believe in them, or telling them that. Like I told my kid all the time, and I'm not the world's greatest parent, I'm just a parent. But I said, you got, just a few jobs growing up, learn stuff, make mistakes, have fun. If you can do those things repeatedly, you're gonna be all right. But it's such a complex thing to put a system around. I'm with you. I'm kind of system agnostic, because the outcome for this kid is not going to be the same for that kid. And I know a lot of school administrators, and one of the biggest problems they have is they've got to deal with the kids that nobody can deal with. They get, charter schools don't have to take on a kid who's a problem and who creates lawsuits for districts and all these other things. This all complicates this entire thing. So when you have a system and you don't account for all this noise, how on earth do you ever get anything out of it?
Right. I think one really important thing to say is part of the resistance to this, I of course believe that people genuinely want to do the best for the students, and to think the best for them, and in that that impulse, they're defending the idea that every kid can flourish, because I think that's what's best for the kid. But so that's well-meaning. But there's another side of this which is really important to say, which is, if it's true that we are born with significantly different ability to succeed academically, then the moral defense of the whole system starts to get chipped away at, right? Because if you want to justify the system right now, you say, well, look, if you work hard, you can learn and be smart, and you can go and work in Silicon Valley as a coder, or you can be an investment banker on Wall Street, and you too can achieve the American dream. That's only true, though, if you actually have the underlying academic talent necessary to acquire those skills. Right. There's this whole learn to code meme on the internet. Sometimes it's expressed as genuine advice. Sometimes it's expressed as a way to mock people. But as I always tell people, not everyone can learn to code. Coding is really hard, right? You have to have a particular kind of analytical and mathematical brain. I could never be a coder. If I set out today and I'm sick of this, bad writer pay, I want to be a computer scientist, I would get nowhere. I know it because I know my own brain, right? So if that's true, right, it undermines the sense of fairness that's built into the system. It says like, actually, there's a lot of your life that is not under your control, including your own brain. And so this notion that what I'm getting is fair becomes harder to justify.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And that's
Go ahead, Chris.
I've dabbled in coding a little bit, and I get that's an easy one to understand there. It's hard for, it requires such an immense amount of focus that it really is a narrow slice of the population that's gonna find any appeal in that, and or being a Wall Street banker or anything like that. Right. Are you familiar with Chris Renner's work? This photography, front row kids and back row kids, and like.
Yeah, I think his book Dignity was pretty recent. Yeah.
Right. He's done. It reminded me of, in his terminology, the front row kids are the ones who can succeed because they're the ones who can do well in school and go. They have the requisite ability to succeed in an academic environment and to go on to careers in either in tech or in finance or whatever else have you. But there really is a that's maybe another thing we could discuss next is how there's the threshold for how much cognitive ability you have to get a good job is much higher than it was, say, 50 or 100 years ago.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, look, 1,000 years ago, could you dig a ditch fast was a really important sort of set of skills, right?
Yeah.
And so, your natural phenotype, right? Like the way that your body was built made a big deal, had a big deal to do with whether or not you could get that kind of employment. Now we don't dig ditches so much anymore. At least most people don't. And now we're using our brains. I think it's important to say there's a chance that in the future, the calculation is going to be very different because so much of the raw processing that we rely on our brains for now is going to be offshored to computers and AI, right? Mm-hmm. Like one of the ironies of the learn to code thing is, don't get me wrong, it's going to be very lucrative to be a computer scientist for a long time, and we'll always be computer scientists. Mm-hmm. But there are companies that are working and making a lot of progress in writing code that writes code. Right? They're creating code that itself can produce code for many of the average everyday tasks that you need. I also think it's really important to say that so that might change, right? The raw processing thing might become less valuable because we all can process everything with a computer. The other thing is, I think that it's important to say the scale of employment is really different now than it was before. In other words, so Google has a vastly bigger market cap in terms of its value than GM ever did, right? Mm-hmm. But when GM was at its height, it was employing orders of magnitude more people than Google does now, right? GM needed many more people to be on the assembly line. I mean, GM had hundreds of thousands of employees, and a company like GM creates all these satellite companies around it for servicing and parts and whatever. So that was a company that was flourishing and creating a lot of opportunity for people. Google, I don't know, does Google have 50,000 employees maybe?
Maybe it's not many, yeah.
Yeah, so a tiny fraction of what GM once had for the similar market cap size. Think again about these computer scientists. A computer scientist's output is infinitely scalable, so you don't need that many of them, right? If I'm a computer scientist, I make a program, everybody can have it immediately. So that's me doing the job to produce something for everybody. If you want to buy a car, right, somebody has to make all those cars. Mm-hmm. So there's just a scale of employability that was much bigger in the industrial period than there is now in the digital period. Right. Like a big part of why digital companies are so valuable is because they can achieve such profits with such small human costs, labor costs, right? And so this is like a real challenge to what we've got going on here, because if the biggest companies employ so few people, it's not a reliable path to employment. I mean, there was a time in this country when you could go to the factory at the edge of town right?
Mhm.
And if you only had a high school diploma, and that was like, there was always a job, and you got there and you got a decent wage. Maybe you were in a union. You were able to own a home and put a couple kids through college or whatever. That reliable, lower middle class to middle class employment is not being met by Amazon. It's either at the complete low end of Amazon, which is you're in a warehouse and you're making $17 an hour and it's a terrible working conditions, or you're making, $400,000 as some sort of mid-level manager,
Right. Yeah. To add my jump in with my own experience because it's directly relevant. I actually worked at General Motors as a production worker for a couple from 2006 to 2008, and it's even in industries like that, there's been a big difference in terms of how many people they employ. Like they're by that time, and then I'm sure it's even more so now. Most of the press lines are automated. Like you used to have when the plant that I worked at was at its peak. It was I think late 70s, and they had 3,000 workers there, and you had each press on a line had someone to load it, and maybe a second person to unload it. I'm not sure about that. And it's just GM engineered all that, and that's another thing. It's robotics is not as scalable to it's not as scalable as pure software, because you still have physical machines doing a lot of the work, but it's definitely something that could, in as much as you can standardize what your press lines look like and anything like that, then it is something that makes a difference. And that's it's frustrated me just that conservatives a lot of times have been bad about. They'll instantly come back to the argument when you start talking about how these fields don't employ that many people anymore. They're like, oh, well, they're doing more with less. Isn't that great? And, if you're just concerned about output, then I guess you'd be sympathetic to that. But I think we really want to. It really is what everyone's supposed to do. Who's not at the level that they could program the robots or code or do any of the other things we talked about is really what we're concerned about here.
Yeah, I mean,
Freddie,
oh, sorry, go ahead.
I wanted to ask, I want to slightly take the conversation in a slightly different direction, because there's a lot of work that's been done on this. You referenced the Charles Murray book earlier, The Bell Curve. And in his book, Real Education, he talked about our lack of comfort with testing kids. He talked about, we have a pretty good predictive model on where kids are going to be. And, if we really are going to deal with these problems. And by the way, I knew a ditch digger who was getting a divorce in Las Vegas. My friend was a divorce attorney. And this guy had a multi-million-dollar company, and so we do still dig ditches. We dig, slit trenches. We dig, things for septic tanks, all that kind of stuff. And so maybe you take someone who has a lower capacity, because we do test and say, here are fields that you could be good in. Let's build your education around that and customize it. That's terrifying, though, in terms of Big Brother being in charge of what you're allowed to be and creating a caste system. But yeah, maybe. And, Gardner says you can have all kinds of intelligences and other things. Maybe you do need to go towards forestry or river guiding because you're so great at the outdoor educational kind of this side of things. Maybe you're an entrepreneurial mind. I mean, I like you. If you asked me to code, I'd be so bored and so fast. And I don't have a mathematic mind. I don't know if I have math dyslexia, but I've got a master's degree, and the highest class I ever graduated from was like pre-algebra in high school with a D, but I managed to educate myself to a fairly high degree in spite of that. So can we reliably put kids into a testing system and customize an education for them? Because you're right. What we know about genes is continuing to understand how much it actually controls. If it controls our sexual orientation, our sexual preference, I mean, on and on and on. If it controls these things, then why wouldn't it control our capacity to process complex problems?
Yeah. So there's a few things to say. So, I mean, one thing sort of brought up by what you just said is, so like the number one question I get asked about is the trade schools. And, a lot of people say, okay, we're sending too many kids to college, which, we can talk about that, but we need to send people back to trade school to learn a trade and a craft. And they'll say, my uncle has an HVAC business and he does great, The problem with answering the question about trade schools is that just the trades is not a thing, right? It's like the trades is way too big. The term is way too big, and there's way too much variation within that term in terms of outcomes. For me to say yes, trade school is good, because it's just going to what trade and where are you geographically. There's a lot of luck involved in this. So, for example, the last time I checked, one of the jobs with the highest unemployment rate, one of the jobs in that list was a photovoltaic cell installer or whatever. Mm-hmm. And you'd say, that's crazy. Like, we're moving to solar. Like, solar is this big thing. That's green energy. Shouldn't this be a huge thing? And it's just one of the things that I always tell people is, like, you've got to stop presuming that, like, the labor market is going to be predictable. So a lot of people started to get into petrochemical engineering when the price of a barrel of oil was over $100. Mm-hmm. Now it's like $30 or something like that, right? And so the economic incentive fell off a great deal for people who had gotten themselves into expensive programs, and they, suddenly found all these jobs drying up. The trades are also just so, like, to be if you're a unionized mason here in New York City, where I am, you can have a really nice life, right? You can have a good trade that you work, meaningful work that you're going to make in the six figures, and you're going to be able to support a family on that. If you are a mason in Arizona who is getting hired on a day-by-day basis, you're going to be struggling incredibly, right? Like, the context for the trades matters a tremendous deal. So it's just, when you're looking at it from the term of policy, from the perspective of policy, it's just real hard to say, yeah, trade school, because so many things are going to factor into who does well in what context in the trades. I mean, and just in general, like I said, like, look, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, there was a just genuinely insane expansion in the number of pharmacy college programs in this country. So, there were literally, in the span of a decade, hundreds of new schools of pharmacy opened in American colleges and universities, because pharmacy is a solid job with there's, every county needs a couple pharmacies, right? It's high skilled, so the pay is pretty good, and people think it's a good profession. And so it was perceived to be a gap between the number of pharmacists that were coming out and the number of jobs that were needed to be filled. Whether that was true or not, I don't know. But what I do know is that students responded to this sense that pharmacy was the next big thing. Colleges and universities opened up all these pharmacy schools. These kids went into these schools. They emerged. And what did they discover when they graduated, right? That job market was now flooded with new graduates. Right. So it became much harder to find a job. And the jobs that they did get, their wages were depressed by how many people were applying for those jobs, which is a perfectly predictable outcome, right? And so in general, like, you have to be real careful. It's not just about guessing correctly where there's going to be growth. It's about what we're doing. If we're telling people go do this to make a living, then you're just creating more and more competition, which will then undermine your bargaining position, right?
Right. Or maybe that's the point of I don't want to get know how much you can say there's a conspiracy, but it's certainly in the interest of pharmaceutical, say, I don't know, CVS, Rite Aid, whoever employs pharmacists to say that, oh, hey, we're going to have a shortage of pharmacists. Maybe you, a bunch of you guys better go get into this, or tech is always claiming a shortage of. I guess you could probably say it. Probably find any employer at all is going to say that there's a shortage of people doing the stuff that they're hiring for, and whether it's strictly speaking accurate or not. Yeah.
I mean, look, the things that we can count on are we can count on automation to continue to make it more difficult for people to rely on particular sectors. So, you often hear people say, oh, America, we used to make things in this country, right? America has never been producing more manufacturing in the history of the country.
Right.
We make a ton of things. The problem is we're employing something like 1/12 of the people to make those things that we once did in our heyday, because automation has gotten to the point where we can make them without hiring anybody to do it, right? And it's a real, like, it's a real sticky problem. Like, it's really hard to say, there's always this faith that there's going to be about as many available jobs as there are number of people looking for work. But one thing that we know is that not the unemployment rate, because the unemployment rate counts only people who are still looking for work, but the rate of people who are not in a job or pursuing a job, like the number of Americans who just don't work and aren't and no longer attempting to work, is going up and up and up and up, and it has been consistently for decades, right? So you just have this larger and larger layer of people who are not productively committing to the economy, contributing to the economy, and who face often just really miserable lives.
Right. It's a really tough thing. I mean, I'm not sure. What would you? It's tough to say what I don't have any good strong preferences as to what you would do to create more jobs for people, or incentivize creation. I don't know if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, here's what we can do if you're a big lefty like me. Okay, so this big paper just came out just this month from the National Bureau of Economic Research, and it says it sort of was saying, Denmark's big system, its big, social welfare system that has all of these places where it redistributes wealth and helps people economically, child tax credits, universal health care, maternity leave, et cetera, et cetera. They said, well, this has failed because they did all this research and they showed Denmark doesn't have any higher educational mobility than the United States. So even though Denmark is vastly more equal, right? So the usual metric that we use to look at socioeconomic inequality is called the Gini coefficient. Yeah. And Denmark has the lowest Gini coefficient, which is good. Lower is better. Has the lowest Gini coefficient of any country in the developed world. And yet their students are not moving around relative to their parents. And so if you look at like how well their parents did in school, Danish students are not doing any better. And the big assumption was, this big system, this social system, was going to promote that educational mobility that we all want. Well, for one thing, if you do believe in the genes explanation, the fact that social mobility is the same in America and Denmark would make perfect sense, right? Because the consistent low social mobility would be a function of the fact that what's driving your academic performance is your genes more than anything else, right? But some people said, actually, like this is a lesson to us about why a social state like Denmark is good, right? Because it's true, there's no more educational mobility, but they're still highly equal. They still have an absurdly low poverty rate. And they also have some fabulously wealthy individuals and companies, right? So we could have this system which protects people through direct cash redistribution, so that if they fail in the job market, if they don't have the cognitive skills they need, or if automation kills more jobs, or if we have another situation like we did with petrochem engineering, where all of a sudden what we thought would be the next big job turns out not to be, then they're insulated because they've got this system in place. We're not losing out on any educational mobility. Kids don't move in the system. That's just how it works all over the place. And there are individuals who have immense billion-dollar fortunes and companies that are huge multinational corporations. So that to me is the most humane way to deal with this problem is stop expecting the education system to rescue people, right? Because you can't rescue people who lack the basic cognitive ability to excel in these fields, but you can make their lives more comfortable and protect them from the shocks of the economy if you are protecting them with social programs.
Sure. And I think you discussed this, touched on this in the book, as to whether you do that through, say, like a direct cash payments or job subsidies. Do you have a strong preference either way on that?
No, I mean, so there's a big fight going on the left right now, has been for a while, is our basic conception of a job guarantee, or is it of a universal basic income? In other words, does the government create a series of programs that employ people during high unemployment periods designed to be countercyclical, right? As the private sector economy unemployment rate comes down, we shrink the program, et cetera. And there's lots and lots of position papers and stuff you can look at for how this works. And they talk about the dignity of work. They talk about how it's healthier for people to be out there working and not letting their skills atrophy, not becoming, losing their social ability or whatever while they're working these jobs. And that it's also easier to defend politically because people are much more likely to support a program that trades cash for work than just gives cash, right?
Right.
The universal basic income people say a job guarantee program just becomes a make work program, that inevitably it's just like people end up moving boxes from one side of a factory to another, right? That like the jobs aren't actually producing actual positive value for the economy. So you might as well just give people the money if you're going to create, frankly, bullshit jobs that don't need to exist. So that's a big fight. I can't solve it. A lot of people who are smarter than I am are debating it right now. But I just fundamentally don't know what we're going to do if this secular trend of automation continuing to eliminate jobs keeps going. Because there's a lot of people in the economy. I mean, I'm not an Elon Musk fan, but he's a good example of a guy who is like this techno-libertarian. And he's someone who also says, like, look, sooner or later, so many of these jobs are going to be eliminated. And it's not just, the thing is like, automation is not just robot welds a piece on a car rather than a guy used to weld a piece on a car.
Right.
The legal profession, right? So there used to be a whole layer of people in the legal profession, and all they did was document discovery, where they would go through huge amounts of documents to find relevant stuff. Now software does it. And
a robot.
Yeah. A huge number of those jobs are gone, right? Translation. Like there is a field, small, but it's a stable field that had good pay and prestige. Translation is being gutted right now because your phone can do it almost as good anyway, right? Or at least that's what people think. And that's if that continues, I don't see a real sort of like, there's certainly no educational tweak. Here's something I should probably have said earlier. It's you want to, when you talk to people who are of the education will save us camp, right? That we just need to educate our children and the economy will improve. By the way, that includes every U.S. president since at least Reagan and probably going back faster. So, what's the end goal look like, right? Like after we're done doing the work you want done, what does it look like? If all the students all improve at the same rate, right? So they're all smarter than they were before, but their position is the same. You have the same problem, right? The ones at the top will be rewarded. The ones on the bottom won't be rewarded economically. And the fact that they have more knowledge is irrelevant, because in a labor market, what matters is the scarcity of the value you're providing, not the intrinsic value itself, right? So if everybody moves up, it's not going to do anything. If we put everybody into college, which some people will come right out and say, I want everyone to go to college, then the value of college as a credential evaporates.
Sure.
And then it'll be the master's degree. And then, they'll probably invent a new degree rather than going through the doctoral program. But like the pressure to get more and more credentials will keep going up, because once everybody has something, it has no economic advantage, right? The 95% of Americans get a high school diploma now. The high school diploma is not getting you a job, you know?
Right.
Right.
It's the certificate process. You can get a certificate for this, you can get certified in that, and that's the thing that's in between kind of the bachelor's and all the other jobs.
Right.
You're talking. I tore apart my my garage, or not my garage, my closet the other day. We're going to rebuild it, and in it, holding up the coat rack were wooden handmade coat rack holders, because our house is old enough that some dude sat there with a drill press and a lathe and made things that hold coat racks all day. That job's gone. The good news about all of that is that the pace of innovation is always greater than the pace of automation, and so we can get ahead of these jobs. But if you're cognitively and personally inclined to go do this kind of jobs, if you're not, and you're driving a truck or one of these other jobs, look, they have lawyers, robot lawyers that fight speeding tickets and traffic tickets now.
Yeah.
These aren't real people, and so, like you said, lawyers are being picked off of this pile. The other thing I wonder about, and I want to get your thoughts on this. I mean, you can lean left, maybe Chris leans right. I kind of stand up in the middle. I kind of can't decide, which side I'm on. But as a nation, we seem like we're too divided to be socialists. Like, we can't agree on how to fry an egg,
Right.
or what side the toilet paper is supposed to fall over on. And so when we look at a country like Denmark, I think we're doing ourselves a disservice, because if you were to look at the number 2 population from any country in the world, that's a good chance it's in America. Whether it's Vietnam or Chad or any other country, we probably have the second biggest population in the world in that. And so we struggle to, en masse, start on the left foot instead of everybody running in a different direction. Is it even possible to look at these? And I don't want to say socialism is bad, but is that even possible here to try to figure out when we can't even agree on who won the damn election?
So, I mean, look, like one of the claims that have been made about the Scandinavian social states, the social democratic states in Scandinavia, some people say that succeeds, that works because they are so homogenous. So they don't have anything like America's racial diversity. There's not a lot of religious diversity. There aren't a lot of different ethnic groups. It's just it's people who are very much like each other, and that makes it easier for people to believe in each other. And if you believe in each other, then you are more likely to say, this person needs a hand up. And I think a really bad news, no matter what your political orientation, this is one of the quietly most consequential things that's been happening in America for 40 years and nobody knows about it. So when they do the big political polls, one of the things they do is they measure social trust, and they just literally just ask people, do you think basically people can basically be trusted, right? And that says whether you have high
trust or low trust societies.
Yes, that number, the number of people who say yes, people can basically be trusted, has dropped 40% since the 70s. And nobody knows why. But it is, if you think about just any democracy as requiring a interchange between people who are not alike each other, that's scary. I will say this. If you express economic programs in simple terms, they tend to be pretty popular. So, one of these classic, things, political scientists love to say that the American people is not coherent politically. It's really classic findings. Someone will say, I'm a conservative, and then they will be in favor of, one social program after another, which to us doesn't make sense, because, we think about politics a lot and we know how these things fit into each other. But most people don't sit around pondering what my political philosophy is. They just sort of react. So the two most popular issues in America, true for decades, most solid sort of support of anything, are Medicare expansion and Social Security protection, right? Expand Medicare so more people are eligible, and protect the Social Security benefits.
Right.
That's true across every political demographic, right? We think of Republicans as people who want to cut taxes, right? But protecting Social Security is just a far more popular priority among Republican voters than cutting taxes, right? So those are the two most socialist programs in the United States, right? So there's a sense in which rather than,
but don't call them socialists because people paid into them.
Well, there you go. So I tell people all the time,
Exactly.
I'm a socialist who is ready to drop the socialist label because it's unpopular, right?
Mm-hmm.
And instead say, hey, look, we want to give you health care.
Right.
Your taxes are going to go up across the country if that happens, but we'll give you health care. Does that seem like a good bargain for you? And either we'll be able to convince them it's a good bargain or we won't. We'll win or we'll take our lumps, but we'll just lay that out. That's the deal, right? Everybody pays more taxes. It's great. It's progressively striated, so it's people at the top pay more. But we're going to have this much simpler and more comprehensive medical system. The American people will say yes or no, right? But that's the way that we should do politics, because to say I'm a socialist is to say, I'm presenting you with an abstract system that seems scary and not really connected to your real life, right? So let's just
guns.
Yeah. So let's just talk programs and values and leave out the jargon. Unfortunately, the Democratic Party does not seem interested in any of that. But
part of the problem is that again, nobody wants to get in the line when they give up everything to get something better. But you have insurance. You should not have to have a job to have medical coverage. That's asinine.
Oh, yeah.
There shouldn't be it shouldn't be insurance. It should be a medical service plan that you can purchase and augment with your whatever it's going to.
And it's a total accident. It's a total accident of history that even happened. It was basically like the companies trying to do an end run around the World War II wage and price controls, and then the IRS 10 years later says, okay, you can keep deducting this. And that's why we have employer-provided health insurance. I
mean, the thing is if the United States was doing a trade where we pay less in taxes and get or pay less for the medical system and get worse, right? That would at least be a coherent thing. Okay, that's a trade adults can choose to make, right? Adults can say it's more important to me that we be paying less for all of this, whether it's taxes or my employer paying whatever, and we get the worst system. Or we pay more and get the better system. But of course, we pay the most and get a bad system, right? We have both a hideously expensive system and some of the worst outcomes. And you just pull your hair out and you're like, how are we still doing this,
Our current medical system produces 5,000 surplus doctors a year that don't get a residency. Think about that. Think about what that would do for medical access to medical care.
And simultaneously... Yeah, and simultaneously, there are a huge number of counties in the rural United States who are desperate for doctors but can't attract them, right? We simultaneously have a surplus and a deficit. It doesn't make any sense.
Right. One thing I've got to bring up because and I'm sorry if I'm boring you guys, but tax structure is near and dear to my heart as an accountant. The Scandinavian social welfare systems, as I understand it, have to do with they're funded at and the taxing and spending goes on at a very local level. I think commune is the level of government that they use, and it's something like their federal or national tax rates are 3-5% at most, and then it's 50. You have 50% marginal tax rates at the commune level, but then it's a local. It's basically imagine your county in the U.S. or a municipality in the U.S. imposing an income tax of 50% and in the federal government imposing next to nothing. It's just, I wonder if anyone on the left has really thought through that and how America might look different if you could get something like that.
I'm not the person to talk about a sound tax policy. Unfortunately, it's just not my area of expertise. I will say that another claim that's been made about the Scandinavian systems is that some of the Scandinavian systems, for example, one part is the taxes are coming out before your check and they don't appear on your check. Yeah. So in other words, you don't perceive it as in a cognitive sense, okay, I'm supposed to be making 100,000 whatever's a year, and this isn't working out. Some of that's coming out of my check, but simply the fact that the immediate, here's my paycheck, here's what's coming out of it is not available to you, increases your sort of satisfaction with tax and spending programs because it doesn't sting for some of the same way. I think that
you get your pay stub and it only has your pay stub only has your net pay on it, nothing else.
Well, this gets back to the healthcare system. So one of the things that makes it hard to convince Americans to switch to a healthcare system is many or most employers are paying a premium that is not represented in your check for your healthcare coverage, right? But if that money was not being paid for that premium, that would be money that would be available to be paid for your labor. Right. So you already are paying a silent tax for your healthcare, even above and beyond the premium that appears on your check, right? And that's part of one of the hard parts about doing this is like people don't see that, so they don't perceive the full extent to which they're paying for healthcare every month. Or
they don't see, and they really, there's a big gap between what someone sees and their employer paying them and what they're actually costing their employer, and that's kind of what's made me more sympathetic towards it. If you get rid of employer provided health insurance and the cost is a national healthcare system or something of the sort, then maybe it's not a bad trade.
Yeah, I mean, I just think in general, durable goods like electronics are become vastly cheaper even as they're becoming better. You know, like the cost of a TV now, if you adjust them for inflation, is insane. Even though it's insanely cheap, even though it's so much better than the product that came before it. And that's true in many sectors, but education, healthcare, housing, and also a senior care are things that just keep going higher and higher and higher. And they're things that everyone has to pay or has to pay eventually anyway. And we have no idea how to stop that runaway spending in any case, right?
Well, listen, I had you here for an hour, man, and I really appreciate you coming on and talking about your book. Everybody should get Freddie's book. It's called The Cult of Smart, How Our Broken Education System Perpetuates Social Injustice. Get it on Amazon. Use that link. That'll give me a little bit of money and help balance the scale a little bit. And as always, I love talking about these issues. And we just had an hour-long conversation. And probably none of us agree with each other 100% politically, but we had a very calm and rational talk about, like, these are things we need to figure out: education. We need to figure out medicine. And we certainly have the capacity and certainly have the money in this nation to do that, but we have to have conversations like this. And so I appreciate the heck out of Chris for suggesting it, and out of you, Freddie, for sitting there for an hour and letting us hammer away at you.
Yeah, I had a great time. Thank you.
Definitely, it's been great.